In the grand halls of Versailles, where golden mirrors reflected centuries of royal tradition, a simple wooden soldier would spark a rebellion that would forever change how a future king saw the world. This isn't just another tale of palace intrigue or royal scandal. This is the extraordinary true story of how one brave palace guard risked everything to give a lonely prince the one thing money couldn't buy: a real childhood. What started as an act of kindness between a commoner and royalty would challenge the very foundations of how French nobility raised their children, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance create the biggest waves in history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palace of Versailles as Captain Henri du Bois adjusted his ceremonial sword and prepared for another day of what many would consider the most prestigious yet tedious job in all of France. As head of the Royal Guard's inner circle, Henri had spent the last 15 years protecting the most powerful family in Europe, but today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the unusual silence that seemed to hang in the air, or maybe it was the way young Prince Louis had looked at him the previous evening, with eyes that seemed far too old for his 8-year-old face. Henri had grown up in the countryside outside Paris, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by the gold in his pockets, but by the strength of his character. When Henri first arrived at Versailles as a young soldier, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer magnificence of it all. The endless corridors lined with priceless paintings, the gardens that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, and the constant parade of nobles dressed in silks and satins that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But 15 years of palace life had taught Henri to see beyond the golden facade. He had witnessed the loneliness that lurked behind the jeweled masks, the way children were treated more like political assets than human beings, and how the rigid protocol of court life could crush the spirit of even the most resilient soul. Nowhere was this more evident than in the daily routine of Prince Louis, the heir to the throne of France. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Henri would take his position outside the prince's chambers. He would watch as a parade of tutors, etiquette masters, and royal advisors filed in and out, each one determined to mold the young boy into the perfect future monarch. There were lessons in Latin and Greek, instruction in proper posture and speech, sessions on the complex web of European politics, and endless hours of practicing the ceremonial duties that would one day define his life. Henri often found himself wondering when the prince had last simply played like other children. When had he last run through a field chasing butterflies, or built castles in the sand, or even held a simple toy that wasn't crafted from precious metals and designed more for display than enjoyment? The more Henri observed, the more his heart ached for this child who had everything material wealth could provide but seemed to possess so little of what truly mattered. The turning point came on a particularly dreary Tuesday in November. Henri was making his usual rounds through the palace when he heard an unusual sound coming from the prince's study. It wasn't the typical droning of a tutor or the scratch of a quill on parchment. Instead, he heard something that had become increasingly rare in these halls: the sound of a child's laughter. Curiosity getting the better of him, Henri quietly approached the partially open door and peered inside. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. Prince Louis was sitting on the floor, completely ignoring his mathematics lesson, playing with what appeared to be a small wooden horse that one of the kitchen servants had apparently carved from a piece of scrap wood. The prince was making soft, neighing sounds and galloping the simple toy across the ornate carpet, his face alive with genuine joy for the first time Henri could remember. The moment was shattered when Master Beaumont, the prince's primary tutor, noticed the unauthorized toy. "Your Highness," he exclaimed, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Such common playthings are entirely inappropriate for a future king. Where did you acquire this peasant's trinket?" Henri watched as the light died in the young prince's eyes. Louis reluctantly handed over the wooden horse, his small fingers lingering on its rough carved mane as if trying to memorize the feel of something real and unpretentious. "I found it," the prince whispered, which Henri knew was likely untrue but showed the boy's instinct to protect whoever had shown him such kindness. "Well, it shall be disposed of immediately," Master Beaumont declared, tossing the little horse into the fireplace where it would soon be reduced to ashes. Now, let us return to your multiplication tables. A king must be able to calculate taxes and tribute with perfect accuracy. As Henri continued his patrol, he couldn't shake the image of Prince Louis's crestfallen expression. That evening, as he walked through the servants' quarters on his way to his own modest room, he found himself stopping by the workshop where Jean-Claude, an elderly carpenter, was finishing some minor repairs to the palace furniture. Jean-Claude, Henri said, settling onto a wooden stool beside the old craftsman's workbench. Tell me, do you have children? The carpenter's weathered face broke into a smile. Aye, Captain. 5 of them, all grown now, with little ones of their own. Why do you ask? What did they play with as children? What brought them joy? Jean-Claude chuckled and set down his plane. Simple things, Captain. Stick horses and corn husk dolls, spinning tops carved from oak, little boats to sail in the creek. My Pierre, he had a wooden sword I made him when he was no bigger than Tadpole. Thought he was the greatest knight in all of France, that one did. And were they happy? Henri asked, though he already knew the answer. Happiest children you ever did see, Jean-Claude replied warmly. Had nothing but love and imagination, but that was everything they needed. That night, Henri lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the contrast between Jean-Claude's children and the lonely prince who lived surrounded by unimaginable luxury, yet seemed to possess so little joy. An idea began to form in his mind. Dangerous, certainly, and potentially career-ending if discovered, but perhaps the right thing to do nonetheless. The next morning, Henri made an unusual request to his superior officer. He asked for permission to occasionally take different routes during his patrols, explaining that varying his routine would make the palace more secure by keeping potential threats guessing about guard movements. The request was approved without question, as Henri had built a reputation for being thorough and innovative in his security procedures. This new flexibility allowed Henri to spend time observing Prince Louis more carefully. What he discovered only strengthened his resolve. The boy was brilliant. His tutors often commented on his quick mind and remarkable memory, but he seemed to be withering under the constant pressure and formality. During brief moments when he thought no one was watching, Henri caught glimpses of the real child. Louis would trace patterns in the frost on his window, whisper stories to himself, or carefully arrange his formal writing quills as if they were little soldiers in a grand adventure. Henri began visiting Jean-Claude's workshop more frequently, always with the pretense of checking security or discussing some minor maintenance issue. During these visits, he would casually mention details about Prince Louis, his age, his interests in horses, and stories of knights, his obvious longing for something authentic in his gilded world. Jean-Claude, being a perceptive man who had raised 5 children, began to understand what Henri was really asking without either of them speaking the words directly. You know, Captain, Jean-Claude said one evening as he put the finishing touches on a small wooden knight, complete with a tiny movable sword and painted shield, I sometimes make toys for my grandchildren. This little fellow here reminds me of the stories my own boys used to love about brave knights and their adventures. Henri picked up the carefully crafted figure, marveling at the attention to detail Jean-Claude had put into something so small. The knight's face had been painted with gentle, kind eyes, and his armor bore tiny scratches and dents that made him look like a warrior with real experience rather than a perfect ceremonial figure. It's remarkable work, Henri said honestly. Any child would treasure such a gift. But the right child, Jean-Claude replied meaningfully. Toys like this, they're not meant for display. They're meant to spark imagination, to help a young mind explore worlds beyond these walls. As Henri walked back toward his quarters that night, the small wooden knight hidden carefully in his uniform pocket, he knew he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. If discovered, he would certainly lose his position and possibly face far worse consequences. The royal household had strict rules about what was appropriate for the prince, and introducing unauthorized items, especially something as common as a wooden toy, would be seen as a serious breach of protocol. But as he thought about Prince Louis's face when he had played with that simple wooden horse, Henri knew that some rules were meant to be broken. The next morning would begin what he would later think of as his most important mission. Not protecting the prince from physical harm, but guarding something far more precious and fragile: the boy's capacity for wonder and joy. The palace bells chimed midnight as Henri carefully planned how he would carry out his act of rebellion. Tomorrow, he would begin his campaign to smuggle not just toys, but childhood itself, past the elaborate defenses of royal protocol and into the heart of a lonely little boy who happened to be destined to rule France. Little did Henri know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would challenge everything the French court believed about raising royal children, and would create a bond between a common guard and a future king that would influence the course of French history in ways no one could have imagined. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Versailles and casting dancing shadows on the intricate parquet floors. Henri du Bois stood at his post outside Prince Louis's chambers, his heart beating faster than usual as he felt the small wooden knight pressing against his ribs from its hiding place inside his uniform jacket. For 15 years, he had followed every rule and protocol to the letter, but today he was about to become something he had never imagined: a smuggler of joy. The morning proceeded according to its usual rigid schedule. At 7 o'clock, Master Beaumont arrived with his leather satchel full of lessons and disapproval. At 7:30, Madame de Montespan, the prince's etiquette instructor, swept in with her measuring stick and endless corrections about posture and proper speech. By 8 o'clock, the prince's study was filled with the familiar sounds of conjugating Latin verbs and reciting the genealogies of European noble houses. Henri knew from months of careful observation that there would be a brief window of opportunity around 10 o'clock. Master Beaumont always took a 15-minute break at precisely that time to consult with the kitchen staff about the prince's lunch menu, believing that even meals were educational opportunities that required careful planning. During these few precious minutes, Prince Louis would be alone in his study, supposedly reviewing his morning lessons, but more often simply staring out the window at the gardens he was rarely allowed to explore. As the ornate clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, Henri watched Master Beaumont exit the prince's study with his characteristic brisk stride. This was the moment Henri had been planning for all night. Moving with the quiet efficiency that had made him an excellent guard, he slipped into the study and gently closed the door behind him. Prince Louis looked up from where he sat, at his enormous mahogany desk, his small figure dwarfed by the formal furniture designed for adult use. His face showed surprise, but not alarm. Henri had always been kind to him, offering gentle smiles and respectful greetings during their brief encounters in the palace corridors. "Captain du Bois," the prince said, automatically straightening his posture as he had been taught. "Is everything well? Has something happened?" Henri approached the desk slowly, his hand moving to the hidden pocket in his jacket. "Everything is perfectly fine, Your Highness. I simply wanted to give you something that I thought might bring you pleasure." The word pleasure seemed to catch the young prince off guard. In his world, activities were described as educational, necessary, or character-building, but rarely as pleasurable. Henri carefully withdrew the wooden knight from his jacket and placed it gently on the desk in front of Prince Louis. The boy's eyes widened with wonder as he took in every detail of Jean-Claude's craftsmanship. The knight stood about 6 inches tall, carved from a rich piece of oak that had been sanded smooth and painted with remarkable skill. His tiny shield bore a coat of arms that Jean-Claude had invented, a golden lion on a blue field, symbolizing courage and nobility, but belonging to no real house, and therefore safe from political implications. "He's beautiful," Prince Louis whispered, his voice filled with awe. "But, Captain, I'm not supposed to have toys like this. Master Beaumont says they're inappropriate for someone of my station." Henri knelt beside the prince's chair, so they could speak at eye level, something that was strictly forbidden by court protocol, but felt absolutely necessary in this moment. "Your Highness, may I tell you a secret?" The prince nodded eagerly, leaning forward with the curiosity that was natural to children, but had been carefully discouraged in his formal education. "When I was a boy," Henri said quietly, My father made me a wooden sword from a branch of our old apple tree. It wasn't fancy or decorated with jewels, but when I held it, I could imagine myself on grand adventures. I could be a knight protecting innocent people, or an explorer discovering new lands, or simply a boy playing in the sunshine. Those moments of imagination made me stronger and braver, and they helped shape me into the man I am today. Prince Louis picked up the wooden knight with reverent care, his small fingers tracing the painted details of the armor and the tiny sword. "What's his name?" he asked, and Henry's heart swelled at the question because it showed that the boy instinctively understood that toys were more than objects. They were companions and gateways to adventure. "That's for you to decide, Your Highness. A knight's name should reflect his character and the adventures he'll share with his companion." The prince held the knight up to catch the morning light streaming through the window. "Sir Braveheart," he declared after a moment of serious consideration, because he looks like he would be very brave and would help other people be brave too. Before Henri could respond, they both heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Master Beaumont returning from his consultation about lunch menus. Moving quickly but calmly, Henri helped Prince Louis hide Sir Braveheart in the deep drawer of his desk, underneath some unused writing paper. "Remember," Henri whispered as he stood to leave, "this is our secret. Sometimes the most important things are the ones we keep close to our hearts." Master Beaumont entered just as Henri was adjusting his uniform and preparing to resume his patrol. "Captain," the tutor acknowledged with a slight nod. "I trust everything is secure." "Perfectly secure, Master Beaumont," Henri replied truthfully, though he knew they each had different definitions of what needed to be kept safe. Over the following days, Henri found opportunities to check on Prince Louis during the brief gaps in his schedule. What he discovered filled him with joy and confirmed that his risk had been worthwhile. The prince had begun incorporating Sir Braveheart into his daily routine in small, careful ways that wouldn't attract attention. During mathematics lessons, the knight would stand guard over his calculations. While practicing penmanship, Sir Braveheart would be positioned as if watching over important documents. And during the long, tedious hours of memorizing court protocol, the prince would occasionally glance at his desk drawer, drawing strength from knowing his wooden companion was there. Henri also noticed changes in the prince himself. Louis began sitting a little straighter, not from the rigid training of his etiquette lessons, but from a new sense of inner confidence. He started asking more questions during his history lessons, particularly about the knights and heroes whose stories had previously seemed as distant and formal as everything else in his education. Most remarkably, Henri caught glimpses of the boy smiling to himself during quiet moments, as if he was carrying on private conversations with his hidden friend. Encouraged by these positive changes, Henri began planning his next move. Jean-Claude had mentioned that he was working on other pieces, a small wooden horse that could actually gallop when pulled by a string, and a tiny castle complete with movable gates and flags. But Henri knew that introducing more items would require even greater care and planning. The opportunity came during the prince's weekly music lesson. Monseigneur Leclerc, the elderly music master, had a habit of becoming so absorbed in his own playing that he would sometimes forget about his young student entirely. These lessons took place in the palace's music room, which was located in a wing that Henri often patrolled, and which had several alcoves and side chambers where items could be temporarily hidden. Henri spent several days mapping out the exact timing and route he would need to use. He observed that Prince Louis always arrived at the music room 5 minutes before his lesson began, as punctuality was considered essential for royal behavior. The prince would sit on a velvet bench near the large harpsichord, waiting for Monseigneur Leclerc to finish tuning his instruments and organizing his sheet music. On the appointed day, Henri positioned the small wooden horse in an alcove just outside the music room, wrapped carefully in a piece of soft cloth to protect Jean-Claude's delicate paintwork. As Prince Louis approached for his lesson, Henri caught the boy's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the hidden alcove. The prince, who had become quite skilled at reading these secret signals, glanced around to ensure no one else was watching before quickly stepping into the alcove. When he unwrapped the cloth and discovered the beautiful wooden horse with its flowing mane and realistic proportions, his face lit up with pure delight. "Is this Sir Braveheart's steed?" he whispered to Henri. "Indeed it is, your highness. Jean-Claude, I mean, the craftsman who made Sir Braveheart, thought every knight should have a worthy mount for his adventures." Prince Louis held the horse up and marveled at how the legs were jointed so it could actually gallop when moved properly. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Jean-Claude had even carved tiny horseshoes and painted individual hairs in the mane and tail. "What shall we call him?" the prince asked, and Henri was struck again by how the boy instinctively understood that these weren't just objects but characters in ongoing stories. "That's your choice to make, your highness. A knight's horse is his most trusted companion, so the name should be special." Prince Louis considered this seriously as the sounds of Monseigneur Leclerc's harpsichord practice drifted from the music room. "Thunder," he decided finally, because he looks fast and strong, and thunder is powerful, but not scary when you understand it. As the prince carefully wrapped Thunder back in his cloth and prepared to hide him with Sir Braveheart, Henri felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He was witnessing something precious and rare, a child's imagination being nurtured and protected in an environment that usually crushed such things under the weight of duty and protocol. But Henri's activities had not gone entirely unnoticed. Madame de Maintenon, the king's second wife, and a woman known for her sharp eyes and political cunning, had begun to observe subtle changes in Prince Louis's behavior. She noticed that he seemed less listless during formal ceremonies, that he asked more engaging questions during his lessons, and that he occasionally displayed flashes of genuine enthusiasm that were quite different from the dutiful compliance she was accustomed to seeing from royal children. Madame de Maintenon was not necessarily opposed to the prince being happier. She was, in her own way, fond of the boy, but she was suspicious of any changes that she couldn't explain or control. The royal household functioned like a carefully balanced machine, and unexpected variations could indicate problems that needed to be identified and corrected before they caused larger disruptions. She began making subtle inquiries among the palace staff, asking seemingly casual questions about Prince Louis's daily routine and whether anyone had noticed anything unusual about his behavior or possessions. Most of the servants, who were genuinely devoted to the prince's well-being, reported only positive changes, that he seemed more cheerful and engaged with his studies. But Master Beaumont, who prided himself on maintaining strict control over every aspect of the prince's education, was more suspicious. He had noticed that Prince Louis occasionally seemed distracted during lessons, as if his attention was divided between his formal studies and some private source of interest. The tutor began paying closer attention to the prince's desk and belongings, though his searches revealed nothing obvious. Henri, with his years of experience reading the complex political currents of palace life, began to sense that increased scrutiny was being directed toward Prince Louis. He noticed Madame de Maintenon observing the boy more frequently during court functions, and he caught Master Beaumont conducting more thorough inspections of the prince's study between lessons. The danger of discovery was becoming more real with each passing day, but Henri also saw how profoundly the wooden toys had affected Prince Louis. The boy was developing confidence, creativity, and joy, qualities that would serve him well as a future king, but which were being systematically discouraged by his formal education. Henri realized that he had reached a critical point where he would need to be even more careful, or risk not only his own position, but the magical transformation he had been privileged to witness in the Lonely Prince. The stakes were rising, but Henri's commitment to protecting Prince Louis's rediscovered childhood was stronger than ever. As he made his evening rounds through the palace corridors, he began planning how to expand their secret network of joy while staying one step ahead of those who would crush it in the name of royal propriety. Winter had settled over Versailles like a heavy velvet cloak, transforming the palace grounds into a crystalline wonderland that Prince Louis could only observe from behind frost-covered windows. The shortened days and longer nights had intensified the already rigid indoor schedule, leaving the 8-year-old prince with even fewer opportunities for the brief moments of freedom that had begun to sustain his spirits. Henri du Bois found himself watching the boy's increasing restlessness with growing concern, knowing that the wooden knight and horse hidden in the prince's desk were providing comfort, but were no longer enough to satisfy a child's natural need for adventure and exploration. The tension in the palace had been building steadily since Madame de Maintenon had begun her subtle investigation into Prince Louis's improved demeanor. Henri had noticed her lingering in corridors where she previously never ventured, engaging servants in seemingly casual conversations that were clearly designed to gather information. Master Beaumont had become even more vigilant, conducting surprise inspections of the prince's study and belongings at random intervals throughout the day. Despite these increased pressures, Henri couldn't bring himself to abandon his mission. The transformation he had witnessed in Prince Louis was too remarkable to sacrifice to the demands of palace politics. The boy who had once sat listlessly through his lessons now participated actively, asking thoughtful questions about the historical figures they studied, and showing genuine curiosity about the world beyond Versailles. During court ceremonies, instead of fidgeting with boredom, the prince now stood with quiet dignity, occasionally catching Henry's eye across the room and sharing secret smiles that spoke of shared adventures and hidden treasures. It was during one of these formal court sessions that Henri noticed something that would change the course of their careful conspiracy. Prince Louis, dressed in his miniature court costume of silk and gold thread, was standing with perfect posture during a lengthy diplomatic presentation about trade agreements with Spain. To the casual observer, he appeared to be the model of royal attention and decorum. But Henri, who had learned to read the subtle signs of the prince's inner life, noticed that the boy's left hand was positioned in a way that suggested he was discreetly manipulating something small and hidden within the folds of his elaborate costume. Henry's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. Prince Louis had somehow managed to bring Sir Braveheart to the formal ceremony, hidden so skillfully that none of the other adults in attendance had noticed. The prince was drawing strength and comfort from his wooden companion during what Henri knew was one of the most tedious and stressful parts of his royal duties. It was a brilliant solution that showed remarkable ingenuity, but it was also incredibly dangerous. After the ceremony ended and the nobles dispersed to their various evening activities, Henri found an opportunity to approach Prince Louis in one of the smaller antechambers adjacent to the main reception hall. The boy was alone for a moment while his formal escort prepared for the walk back to his chambers. "Your Highness," Henri said quietly, moving close enough to speak without being overheard. "That was very clever what you did today, but also very risky. If Sir Braveheart had fallen from your costume, or if someone had noticed the movement of your hand." Prince Louis looked up at Henri with eyes that seemed far too mature for his young face. "I know it was dangerous, Captain, but I felt so much braver having him with me. Sometimes during those long ceremonies, I imagine that Sir Braveheart and I are on important missions, protecting the kingdom from invisible threats that only we can see." Henry's heart ached at the boy's words, recognizing the creative way Prince Louis had found to transform boring court obligations into meaningful adventures. But he also understood the impossible position they were both in, caught between the prince's natural need for childhood wonder and the ruthless demands of royal protocol. "Understand, Your Highness, and I'm glad Sir Braveheart brings you comfort. But we must be even more careful than before. There are people who are watching you more closely now, and if they discover our secret, it won't just be the toys that are taken away." Prince Louis nodded solemnly, understanding far more about palace intrigue than any 8-year-old should have to. "What should we do, Captain? I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." The boy's concern for Henry's well-being, despite his own vulnerable position, strengthened the guard's resolve to find a way to continue their conspiracy while reducing the risks for both of them. That night, as Henri walked his final patrol through the quiet palace corridors, he began formulating a plan that would require the help of allies he had never previously considered involving in their secret operation. The next morning, Henri made his way to the palace kitchens during the early hours when most of the staff was busy preparing breakfast for the royal household. He found Marie-Claire, the head baker's assistant, kneading dough for the day's bread with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who had performed the same task thousands of times. Marie-Claire was a woman in her 40s who had worked at Versailles for over 20 years, and Henri had always respected her sharp intelligence and fierce loyalty to the people she cared about. Marie-Claire, Henri said, settling onto a stool near her workstation. May I speak with you about a delicate matter? She looked up from her dough with curious but cautious eyes. Palace servants learned early to be wary of unusual conversations, as words had a way of being twisted and used against people in the complex political environment of Versailles. Of course, Captain Du Bois. What's on your mind? Henri had spent considerable time deciding how much to reveal to potential allies, ultimately concluding that partial honesty would be more effective than elaborate deceptions. I've been observing Prince Louis during my duties, and I'm concerned about his well-being. He seems lonely and isolated despite being surrounded by tutors and courtiers all day long. Marie-Claire's expression softened immediately. Like many of the palace servants, she had developed a genuine fondness for the young prince, who was always polite and kind in his interactions with the staff. The poor little one does seem sad sometimes. All those fancy lessons and ceremonies, but rarely a chance to just be a child. Exactly, Henri continued carefully. I was wondering if you might know of small ways to bring a bit of joy into his daily routine. Nothing that would violate protocol, of course, but perhaps little touches that might brighten his day. Marie-Claire studied Henri's face with the perceptive gaze of someone who had learned to read between the lines of palace conversations. What kind of little touches did you have in mind, Captain? Henri had prepared for this question. Well, I noticed that he particularly enjoys the sweet pastries you prepare for his afternoon refreshments. Perhaps occasionally you might shape them into interesting forms, animals or castles or knights, just to give him something unexpected to discover. A slow smile spread across Marie-Claire's flour-dusted face as she understood both what Henri was really asking and what he was trying to protect the prince from. You know, Captain, I did used to make shape pastries for my own children when they were small. There's no rule saying the prince's food has to be perfectly round or square, is there? None whatsoever, Henri agreed, feeling a surge of relief at finding such a perfect ally. Over the following weeks, Marie-Claire began incorporating subtle creativity into Prince Louis's meals. A breakfast roll might be shaped like a tiny horse, or an afternoon tart might bear the impression of a castle tower. These small surprises appeared irregularly and unpredictably, making them feel like magical discoveries rather than planned treats. Prince Louis never commented directly on these special foods, but Henri noticed that he ate with more enthusiasm and often seemed to examine his meals carefully before eating them, as if looking for hidden messages or tiny adventures. Meanwhile, Henri had also approached Jean-Claude with a new request. Instead of creating additional toys that would need to be hidden and risk discovery, Henri asked the carpenter to teach him basic wood-carving techniques. Henri's plan was to learn to create small, simple figures that could be easily concealed or even destroyed if necessary, reducing the accumulation of evidence while still providing Prince Louis with the creative stimulation he desperately needed. Jean-Claude was delighted to share his skills with someone who appreciated the craft, and Henri proved to be an apt student. Working by candlelight in his small quarters after completing his guard duties, Henri began carving tiny figures no larger than his thumb. A miniature dragon, a sailing ship, a brave peasant girl with a basket of flowers. Each piece could be easily hidden in a pocket or tucked into the binding of a book, and each represented hours of careful work that Henri found surprisingly meditative and satisfying. The delivery system for these micro-treasures required considerable ingenuity. Henri discovered that Prince Louis had developed a habit of running his hand along the carved moldings and decorative elements throughout the palace during his walks between lessons. By carefully placing tiny wooden figures in the crevices and recesses of this ornate architecture, Henri could create treasure hunts that appeared completely natural and innocent to any observer. Prince Louis quickly understood this new game and began checking certain locations regularly for surprises. A tiny wooden owl might appear on the windowsill of the music room, or a miniature castle might be tucked behind the decorative scrollwork near the library entrance. The prince would palm these small treasures with the smooth efficiency of a seasoned spy, carrying them briefly before finding safe places to hide them in his private chambers. This expanded network of joy brought new energy to Prince Louis's daily routine. Henri noticed that the boy now moved through the palace with subtle purpose, as if he were constantly on secret missions that made even the most mundane activities feel significant and exciting. The prince's academic performance continued to improve, and his tutors began commenting favorably on his increased focus and engagement with his studies. But success brought new dangers. Master Beaumont, frustrated by his inability to identify the source of Prince Louis's mysterious transformation, began implementing more invasive surveillance techniques. He started arriving unexpectedly for lessons, hoping to catch the prince in some unauthorized activity. He began questioning other servants about their interactions with Prince Louis, and he instituted random searches of the prince's chambers and belongings. The crisis Henri had been dreading finally arrived on a cold February morning when Master Beaumont discovered Thunder, the wooden horse, during one of his surprise inspections. Prince Louis had hidden the toy in a hollowed-out space behind a loose board in his wardrobe, but the tutor's increasingly thorough searches had finally uncovered the hiding place. Henri was making his morning rounds when he heard raised voices coming from the prince's study. He immediately recognized Master Beaumont's tone of outraged authority and Prince Louis's higher-pitched responses, which seemed to alternate between defiance and distress. Moving closer to the partially opened door, Henri could hear the confrontation escalating rapidly. "Where did you acquire this inappropriate item?" Master Beaumont was demanding. "Who gave you permission to possess such common toys? This is exactly the kind of corrupting influence that we work so hard to protect you from." Prince Louis's response was barely audible, but Henri caught the words "found it" and "not hurting anyone," spoken with the kind of desperate courage that children summon when protecting something precious. Henri realized that the moment he had long feared had finally arrived. The careful conspiracy that had brought so much joy and growth to Prince Louis was about to be exposed, and the consequences for everyone involved would likely be severe. But as he listened to the 8-year-old prince trying to protect his wooden treasures and the adults who had helped him find moments of happiness, Henri knew that his next decision would define not only his own future, but the kind of man he truly was. The confrontation in the prince's study was reaching a critical point, and Henri had to choose between his career and his conscience, between the safety of following orders and the courage required to protect something infinitely more valuable than his position at court. Henri du Bois stood frozen in the marble corridor outside Prince Louis's study, his hand instinctively moving to the pommel of his ceremonial sword as he listened to the confrontation escalating within. Master Beaumont's voice had taken on the cold, calculated tone that court officials used when they believed they had uncovered evidence of serious misconduct, while Prince Louis's responses were becoming increasingly desperate and tearful. In that moment, Henri realized that all his careful planning and precautions had led to this inevitable crossroads where he would have to choose between his loyalty to the crown and his devotion to the lonely child who had captured his heart. Taking a deep breath that he knew might be among his last as a royal guard, Henri knocked firmly on the study door and entered without waiting for permission. The scene that greeted him confirmed his worst fears while also strengthening his resolve. Master Beaumont stood behind the prince's desk, holding Thunder the wooden horse in one hand and what appeared to be Sir Braveheart in the other, his face flushed with righteous indignation. Prince Louis sat in his chair with tears streaming down his face, his small hands clenched into fists as he tried to maintain some semblance of the dignity that had been drilled into him since birth. "Master Beaumont," Henri said with careful formality, "I heard raised voices and wanted to ensure that His Highness was not in any distress." The tutor wheeled around to face Henri, his eyes blazing with triumph at what he clearly believed was a major discovery. "Captain du Bois, your timing is fortuitous. I have just uncovered evidence of a serious breach of protocol." Prince Louis has been secretly possessing inappropriate toys that are entirely unsuitable for someone of his station. More concerning still, these items appear to have been provided by someone within the palace, which suggests a conspiracy to undermine the prince's proper education. Henri looked at Prince Louis, who was watching him with eyes full of hope and terror, clearly wondering whether his protector would abandon him in this moment of crisis. The sight of the boy's tear-stained face and trembling hands made Henri's decision easier than he had expected it to be. "Master Beaumont," Henri said calmly, moving to stand beside Prince Louis's chair. "Those toys were provided by me at my initiative and without the prince's knowledge or request. If there has been any breach of protocol, the responsibility lies entirely with me." The silence that followed Henri's confession seemed to stretch for eternity. Master Beaumont's mouth opened and closed several times as he processed this unexpected admission, while Prince Louis looked up at Henri with an expression of pure amazement that the captain would voluntarily accept blame for their shared conspiracy. "You?" Master Beaumont finally managed to sputter. "You deliberately introduced unauthorized items into the prince's possession? Do you have any idea of the seriousness of your actions? The corrupting influence you may have had on the future king of France." Henri straightened to his full height, drawing upon 15 years of military bearing and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. "Master Beaumont, I have served this royal family faithfully for 15 years, and my actions regarding Prince Louis have been motivated by nothing but genuine concern for his well-being and proper development." "His proper development?" Master Beaumont's voice rose to nearly a shout. "His proper development involves learning discipline, duty, and the serious responsibilities that will one day rest upon his shoulders. It does not involve playing with peasant toys and indulging in frivolous fantasies." "With respect," Henri replied, his voice remaining steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say, "I believe Prince Louis's development should include learning to think creatively, to understand the experiences of all his future subjects, and to maintain the capacity for joy and wonder that will help him become not just a dutiful king, but a wise and compassionate one." Master Beaumont stared at Henri as if the guard had suddenly begun speaking in a foreign language. The concept that a commoner would presume to have opinions about royal education, much less act upon those opinions, was so far outside his worldview that he seemed genuinely speechless. Prince Louis, meanwhile, had stopped crying and was watching the exchange between the two adults with fascination. Henri could almost see the boy's mind working as he witnessed someone standing up to authority on his behalf, defending not just the toys, but the principle that his happiness and imagination mattered enough to risk everything to protect. "This is preposterous," Master Beaumont finally declared. "Captain Dubois, you are clearly unfit for your position if you believe that undermining royal protocol is acceptable behavior. I will be reporting this incident immediately to Madame de Maintenon and recommending your immediate dismissal from the Royal Guard." "Henri nodded calmly. "I understand, Master Beaumont. But before you make your report, I would ask that you consider the results of my actions. Has Prince Louis's academic performance improved or declined since he received these toys? Has he become more or less engaged with his studies? More or less respectful in his interactions with palace staff? More or less dignified during court ceremonies?" The questions clearly caught Master Beaumont off guard, as he had been so focused on the breach of protocol that he hadn't fully considered the positive changes he had observed in his student over recent months. His hesitation was answer enough, and Henri pressed his advantage. "Furthermore," Henri continued, "I would submit that a future king who understands the simple pleasures that bring joy to common people, who can imagine himself in their circumstances and appreciate their perspectives, will be far better equipped to rule them justly and compassionately than one who has never been allowed to experience childhood wonder or creative play." Prince Louis had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement and something that looked very much like pride. When Henri paused, the boy stood up from his chair with the kind of quiet dignity that would have made his royal ancestors proud. "Master Beaumont," Prince Louis said, his voice clear and Steady despite his earlier tears, Captain Du Bois has been very kind to me, and the toys he provided have made me happier and helped me learn better. I don't understand why making me happy would be wrong, or why toys that help me imagine brave knights and noble adventures would be corrupting. The 8-year-old's articulate defense of their conspiracy clearly surprised Master Beaumont, who had been expecting shame and remorse rather than reasoned argument. Henri felt a surge of pride at the boys' courage and intelligence, recognizing that their secret activities had indeed helped Prince Louis develop the confidence to speak his mind when something important was at stake. Before Master Beaumont could formulate a response, the study door opened, and Madame de Maintenon entered with her characteristic elegant authority. Henry's heart sank as he realized that their confrontation had attracted the attention of the one person in the palace whose opinion would determine all of their fates. "Gentlemen," Madame de Maintenon said calmly, taking in the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, "I was informed that there was some disturbance in Prince Louis's study. Perhaps someone could explain what has transpired here." Master Beaumont immediately launched into an agitated explanation of his discovery, holding up the wooden toys as evidence of serious misconduct and repeatedly emphasizing the unprecedented nature of Henry's actions. Madame de Maintenon listened without interruption, her expression giving away nothing of her thoughts or intentions. When the tutor finished his account, Madame de Maintenon turned to Henri. "Captain Du Bois, do you confirm Master Beaumont's version of events?" "I do, madame. I take full responsibility for providing Prince Louis with the toys in question, and I stand by my belief that they have been beneficial to his development." Madame de Maintenon then looked at Prince Louis, who stood straighter under her gaze but did not flinch or look away. "And what is your perspective on these events, Your Highness?" Prince Louis glanced briefly at Henri, drawing strength from the captain's supportive presence, before answering with remarkable composure. "Madame de Maintenon, the toys that Captain Du Bois gave me have made me very happy. They help me imagine stories about brave knights and noble adventures, which made all my lessons more interesting. I think I have learned better because I was happier, and I have tried to be more worthy of the kindness that Captain Du Bois showed me." The room fell silent as Madame de Maintenon considered the three very different perspectives she had just heard. Henri knew that her next words would determine not only his own future, but potentially influence how Prince Louis would be raised and educated for years to come. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him as he waited for her judgment. Finally, Madame de Maintenon spoke. "Master Beaumont, I appreciate your vigilance in maintaining proper protocol. However, I must note that in recent months, Prince Louis's tutors have consistently reported improvements in his academic performance, his engagement with his studies, and his general demeanor. While Captain Du Bois's methods were certainly unorthodox, the results seem to have been beneficial rather than harmful." Master Beaumont's face flushed with indignation. "But, Madame, the precedent this sets, the complete disregard for established procedures. The precedent this sets," Madame de Maintenon interrupted with quiet authority, "is that the well-being and proper development of Prince Louis take priority over rigid adherence to rules that may not serve his best interests. Captain Du Bois, while your methods were irregular, your motivations appear to have been genuine and your results positive." Henri could hardly believe what he was hearing, while Prince Louis looked as if he might faint from relief and surprise. Madame de Maintenon continued. "However, in the future, any changes to Prince Louis's routine or possessions should be discussed with appropriate supervisors before implementation. We cannot have palace staff making unilateral decisions about royal education, no matter how well-intentioned." She then turned to Prince Louis with an expression that was almost maternal. "Your Highness, I am pleased to see that you have developed the courage to speak thoughtfully in defense of those who have shown you kindness. This suggests that Captain Du Bois's unconventional gifts may indeed have contributed to your growth in wisdom and character." The resolution that emerged from this confrontation surprised everyone involved. Rather than dismissing Henri or confiscating all of Prince Louis's toys, Madame de Maintenon established a new protocol that would allow for carefully supervised recreational activities and age-appropriate toys, provided they were approved in advance and integrated thoughtfully into the prince's educational program. Jean-Claude was officially commissioned to create a series of educational toys and games that would help Prince Louis learn history, geography, and mathematics through interactive play. Marie Claire's creative food presentations were formally recognized as contributing to the prince's nutrition and morale. And Henri, rather than being punished for his conspiracy, was assigned additional responsibilities for overseeing Prince Louis's physical activities and recreational development. Most importantly, the incident established a new understanding within the royal household that Prince Louis's happiness and emotional well-being were not obstacles to his proper development as a future king, but essential components of it. The lonely, listless child who had once stared sadly out palace windows was gradually replaced by a confident, curious, and compassionate young man who would carry the lessons of his secret wooden companions with him for the rest of his life. Years later, when Prince Louis had become King Louis XV of France, he would be remembered not only for his political achievements, but for his unusual ability to understand and connect with common people. Historians would note his innovative approaches to governance, his support for educational reforms, and his genuine concern for the welfare of all his subjects. Few would know that these qualities had their roots in a simple wooden knight named Sir Braveheart and the courage of a palace guard who believed that every child, even a future king, deserved the magic of imagination and the comfort of authentic friendship. Henri du Bois remained in royal service for the rest of his career, eventually becoming the head of palace security and one of King Louis's most trusted advisors. He never forgot the lesson he had learned during those dangerous winter months at Versailles, that sometimes the most important duty of those who serve is not blind obedience to rules and protocol, but the wisdom to recognize when love and compassion require breaking those rules in service of something far more precious than tradition. The wooden toys he had smuggled past the elaborate defenses of royal protocol had carried more than entertainment into a lonely child's life. They had delivered hope, wonder, and the revolutionary idea that happiness was not a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who would grow up to lead others with wisdom and grace.